This is the M18 Retro Handheld, and it is interesting, to say the least. There's no branding on the listings online, so I'm not entirely sure who makes this. It's not like Anbernic or Powkitty or anything. On the box, there's a logo that says SJ Gam, so it's possible that they made this thing. Either way, this is a very large, very unique handheld, and one that may interest some of you, but may not be for others. First off, a shout out and an apology to Lit NXT, this company here. They sent this out for review a couple months ago, and it's taken me some time to get to it, so my apologies for the delay. You can check them out as well as the M18 at the link in the description. But let's get into this review of this thing here. So here it is. This is the M18, and when I first saw it, it had to be probably one of the less good looking handhelds, at least in my opinion. I'm not a huge fan of the multicolored face buttons, and this has those for sure. The shiny silver text on top of this grayish, almost beige looking color, it just clashes and doesn't look great. And then above Start and Select you have plus and minus, which I've only ever seen on Nintendo Switch, and it turns out that's the volume control. This is available from Lit NXT for $75.99, and it comes in gray or black. I kind of prefer the look of the transparent black. I think it looks much more fitting for this design, but the gray is also pretty nice, and it is resemblant of the Game Boy. Is resemblant even a word? I doubt that it is. Anyway, it's $75.99 for the 64GB version, which is what I have here, or you can pay an extra $10 for the 128GB version, which I imagine should have a bunch more games preloaded. This thing is massive. It's the biggest vertical handheld I've ever used. I mean, here it is next to the Miyoo Mini Plus, and as you can see, the size difference is alarming. The neat thing about this, though, is it is extremely comfortable. It is dummy thick, and it's got these little bumps in the back perfectly fit for your hands. It actually feels like one of the most comfortable handhelds I've used on this channel. It almost feels like how I remember the original Game Boy to feel in my hands, even though I haven't played one of those since probably before I was in high school. I'm old, so that was a long time ago. You got these Nintendo Switch style thumbsticks. For the games you're mostly going to be playing on this thing, I do kind of wish the D-pad was above the left thumbstick, but it is what it is. It is comfortable enough that it still doesn't feel too terribly out of place to use it down here. And on the back, you've got these triggers which actually protrude quite a bit, so they feel more comfortable and natural to use than something you'd find on a much smaller handheld like the Miyoo Mini Plus. The power switch is actually on the bottom, and it's actually a toggle switch like the old Game Boy would have. Most handhelds these days, including these retro emulators, have a power button that you would usually hold to turn on the device. This one actually has a switch that you switch on or off, and it's kind of unique to see that here. You've also got your charging port, your headphone jack, and your SD card slot. Now last week I reviewed the E6 by Game MT, and that thing was rough. Well, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that this thing has some similar issues to the E6, but it's not as bad, and honestly, if you were to choose between the two, I would go with this one. It's got an RK3566 quad-core CPU. This is the same one that you'd find in something like the Powkitty RGB30 and RGB10 Max 3, which are devices that I recommend over this one. But if this one does interest you for its large, comfortable Game Boy style form factor, at least that chip is in here, and it's going to perform pretty well for most retro games. It's got a 4000 mAh battery, which should give you up to 4 hours of gameplay on this thing. And it's got a pretty unique 3x2 screen. I'm not even sure if it's 3x2, it almost looks 16:9 in my eyes. It's a 4.3-inch LCD 480p display. I know 480p may be a turnoff for some, but trust me, this thing is going to look totally fine for most retro games, except for one of the issues that I'm going to get into. This thing does run Linux, and it's got the EmuElec 4.3 system with a front end called Arcade Planet, and it looks very nice, very clean, very functional, and compared to the E6 last time, it is much better and much more straightforward and easy to use. The presentation here when looking through game lists is much better than it was on the E6. You've got screenshots and box art on the left side, and most of the titles are actually going to be recognizable. Every once in a while you'll run into some weird naming issues with some of the games. For example, God of War Chains of Olympus, for some reason on here is called Mars, the Chain of Olympus. It's the right game, but the title is completely wrong, so that's just something you have to kind of deal with. It also doesn't seem to be absolutely jam-packed with multiple copies of the same game, but there are going to be some instances where you will run into that. Okay, what is with Yoshi's Cookie? There's still so many Yoshi's Cookies. How many cookies does that dinosaur need? At the home screen, the start button will bring up the menu, which will bring up your settings, and there's really not much you can do here. When I had seen there were different settings menus, I had some hopes, but those hopes have been a little bit shattered. There's not really much you can change. For example, under system settings, you have information and language, and that's it. There's a section marked advanced underneath that, but there's nothing there. You can't do anything with it. The Y button will bring up your search function, which actually works much better than it did on the E6. You will still need your punctuation and exact characters to look for certain games like Yoshi's Island, but the keyboard will actually have all the punctuation you'll most likely need to look for most games. If you don't see what you're looking for on the main keyboard, you can just hit shift down here in the corner or the 3 dots on the right, and that should bring up something. This thing plays a ton of different emulators. You've got Atari systems, arcade systems, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, all your Sega stuff, PS1, PSP, Neo Geo Pocket, just a whole lot of stuff. Now this is another system where PSP is going to kind of be the main one that's pushed and marketed. That's why you've got this aspect ratio on the screen, and this is something that can play some PSP games, but just like the E6, it's loaded mostly with PSP minis. It can play some lighter PSP games like Dragon Ball Z Shin Budokai, but then again, most of these emulators that have PSP can play Shin Budokai no problem. I don't know what magic they worked on that game, but it runs pretty smoothly on most of these handhelds. If you're looking to play God of War on this thing, you can forget about it. It doesn't run very well. It actually has both God of War PSP games on here, but neither of them are going to run all that great. If you're looking to play this thing out the box and you're not planning to add any of your own ROMs and you want to play PSP, you're mostly going to have to deal with PSP minis, as well as a few of the actual main PSP titles that they have peppered in here. Performance-wise, I mean, it's the RK3566 chip. We've seen it before with systems like the RGB30, which runs pretty well. I mean, if you're looking to mostly play a lot of the older systems up to PS1, performance is going to be just fine. N64 is not something I'd recommend playing a lot of on here. The games I've tested just don't run all that great on here. It may be one of those things where you kind of have to let it compile shaders in the background and then it'll work better the next time you play it. But in my testing so far, it hasn't been great for N64. If you get your hands on this thing, it will be kind of up to you to test the different games available for N64 and see which ones run the way you like them to and which ones don't. Thankfully, this time the buttons are all set up to run pretty much how you'd expect. Strangely, this is probably one of the only retro emulator handhelds I've ever used on this channel that doesn't use the Nintendo layout for the buttons. You can see here the face buttons are A, B, X, and Y like Xbox style and not Nintendo style. If you're used to most of these things having the Nintendo layout, it is going to take some getting used to. Now unfortunately, where I run into some issues is the aspect ratio. I had that problem with the E6, and this has the exact same issue where everything is stretched to fill the screen. So if you're mostly looking to play Game Boy, Super Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, and whatnot, you're going to have to deal with a stretched out screen. Trust me, I've gone into the menus a dozen times. I cannot find any way to change the aspect ratio. The home button here will bring up a little menu where you can resume, save state, load state, and quit game, and that is it. You can't even customize controls. In a way, that is more limiting than the E6, and believe me, I've tried a dozen times with all the different systems, and they all bring up this same menu. I've even tried different button combinations like clicking in the thumbsticks, holding select and pressing various buttons, and none of them do anything. Select and start brings up the same menu that the home button does. It is very limited and there's really not much you can do here at all as far as customization, tweaking anything to your liking, changing any settings. It's just not really an option. And therefore that makes this something a little bit harder to recommend. If you're a stickler for aspect ratios being correct for retro games or different settings that you want to change controls and buttons and whatnot, this one's just going to be hard for me to say, yeah, go ahead and pull the trigger on this one. This is another device that would be pretty easy to recommend for its unique size and form factor, as well as how comfortable it is for the price. The screen is nice, but that aspect ratio is really only going to work for PSP. Everything else is going to be stretched out because it's not the same aspect ratio as the screen. If they made this exact device but smushed the screen in a little bit to make it 4x3, it would be much easier to recommend because the majority of the systems you're going to play on this thing would fit in much better with 4x3. Even Game Boy being 1x1 would look better at a 4x3 aspect ratio as opposed to being fully stretched out to this 3x2, 16x9, whatever this actually is. But if you can look past that, you just want to spend some money on a device, a unique looking device, a big, comfortable device that's going to not really be portable or pocketable, but it is something you can throw into a bag and take with you on the go, then maybe this is something you want to look at. And if so, I will have a link in the description from LitNXT. Again, thank you to them for sending these out for review and for being so patient with this review taking so long to come out. I will have an affiliate link and a coupon code in the description so you can check them out. And even if this one in particular doesn't interest you, they've got a bunch of different popular handhelds from Anbernic, Powkiddy, and so on. And they even have some neat accessories for some of those devices, which I've never seen on other websites. So yeah, thanks again to them, and thanks again to you for watching this video and making it this far. If If you like this video, make sure to check out another video which I'll have linked here. Make sure to subscribe if you're new. I've got more handheld content on the way, as well as some other stuff that's going to be coming in the next couple of weeks before we get back to the handheld stuff. Alright, I'm out of here. It's hot and it's humid, and you can't see me on camera because I'm sweaty. It's hot. It's summer. Okay, bye.